Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History, U.S. History Edition. So today, we are going to continue talking about the Jackson era, and in particular, we're going to focus on the lead up to the events of and the legacy of the Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act. Certainly, we're going to be talking a lot about Native people today. We'll refer to them as Native Americans as well as American Indians today. Both are certainly suitable in referring to Native people. So certainly the painting that you guys see, this one is referring more specifically to the Cherokee Removal, which begins in what is now Georgia and makes its way to Indian Territory, which now is present-day Oklahoma. It's certainly a very tragic time for Native people, and we're going to talk about how we get there, the journey itself, and then, of course, its impact. So, kind of getting to our big learning target, or our main idea, I can explain why thousands of Native Americans were forced to abandon their lands to white settlers and move west. This will be the major focus. For my students, reminder, make sure that you've got your 11-2 guided reading. So, this is all going to begin because many settlers wanted the federal government to relocate Native American tribes to less desirable land west of the Mississippi River. Just a reminder for vocab, relocate means to force a person, or in this case, a group of Native people, to move. And so that's certainly already a really contested idea. Should the federal government be able to do that if it thinks it's in the best interest of the country? And certainly we could argue the merits, I think, of both sides. And so Congress passes the Indian Removal Act, which allows the federal government to pay Native Americans to move. And this was passed again in 1830. You're going to see that it's going to involve moving thousands of people. So in 1834, the Indian Territory was set aside in what is now Oklahoma. This was territory that was largely created as reservations for Native people and Native American Indians to live on. And in particular, you're going to have several tribes that are going to push out against this and resist this. Among them are the Cherokee. Now, we'll kind of get into a little bit more about the Cherokee today, but certainly we're going to mention a variety of different tribes that were affected by the Indian Removal Act. So the Cherokee Nation refuses. They say, no, we're not leaving Georgia. And they are going to eventually take their case all the way, not only from the state, but to the federal level. They're going to go to the Supreme Court with Worcester versus Georgia. It's going to prove to be a very smart move for the Cherokee, but unfortunately it's not going to have the desired end they wanted to. And so, of the tribes that are most affected, we've got the forcing of kind of 5 different nations. We've got Choctaw, the Creek, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and the Seminole nations, which are forced into migration between 1830 and 1840. And again, they're moving into what is now Congress under this provision, or excuse me, to Oklahoma under the provision, of course, by Congress. So when we look at this, unfortunately, thousands die. And when we're looking at the Choctaw, we're looking at a number probably between 3,000 and 4,000. That Creek number is quite a bit higher. The Creek suffer, unfortunately, the death of about close to probably 14,000 people in their nation. The Chickasaw, that number is at about 5,000. Cherokee by far are largest, partially because of their resistance, but partially also because of the journey that they took, that we often refer to as the Trail of Tears. Their number is probably over 16, maybe even approaching 17,000. And the Seminole Nation, who largely was able to resist a lot of it, their number is probably between 3,000 and 4,000. So you can see from the map here, certainly, that different groups had different experiences. Okay, we can look at the red here, which is again probably the one that we're probably more familiar with, the Trail of Tears for the Cherokee Nation, making their way across land through Georgia, partially through Alabama for some tribes, and again making their way towards Fort Gibson in Indian Territory, which is now, of course, Oklahoma. You also notice, kind of unique to the Seminole Nation, some of them are removed and they are shipped across the Gulf of Mexico. You'll also notice certainly the Creek um, making their way from New Orleans, and then New Orleans, of course, to places like Fort Coffee and other portions of Indian Territory. And so each tribe certainly had unique areas and unique experiences on this removal, and unfortunately, a lot of it was very tragic. So we do come back to this image for the Trail of Tears, and unfortunately, this image and this painting in particular captures a lot of the hardship of this. So let's get a little bit of background. So the Cherokee Nation, like we mentioned, they're going to refuse to give up their land in Georgia, and they don't want to go and relocate. This is their ancestral home, been their home for generations. They don't want to leave. So they are going to again refuse to make their way to the set-aside territory of reservations in Oklahoma. And they cite treaties from the 1790s. So again, coming back to the formations of the nation after the passing of the Constitution. The federal government had recognized the Cherokee people in the state of Georgia as a separate nation, their own laws. Well, Georgia, at this time period, is refusing to recognize the Cherokee law and that agreement and wants them removed. The Cherokee sue the state government, and eventually their case gets taken to the Supreme Court, Worcester versus Georgia. And in a surprise, it might come as a surprise, but Chief Justice John Marshall and the court rule in majority that Georgia actually had no right to interfere with the Cherokee because of the federal government had no authority over matters concerning the Cherokee. And they can cite back those treaties to earlier in U.S. history. But President Jackson supports Georgia's efforts to remove the Cherokee. And in fact, he vowed to ignore the Supreme Court, and that's kind of exactly what he does. John Marshall then makes, of course, this quote, I should say, let me give a little bit of context, is from Andrew Jackson, essentially taunting the Supreme Court, in particular John Marshall, who's the Chief Justice. John Marshall has made his decision. I'll let him enforce it. Now, you might recall back to our conversations about the Constitution. We said that the branch that is in charge of enforcing laws is the executive branch. Well, if the executive branch won't listen to the rulings of the Supreme Court, it's difficult for that court and their decision to be enforced. So in this case, unfortunately, beginning with Andrew Jackson and being mostly followed through by Van Buren, later in his presidency, you do unfortunately have the removal of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Native Americans, American Indians. So many of the Cherokee resisted these efforts to be removed from their ancestral homelands and to be displaced from them, but ultimately they're going to be forced out of Georgia by General Winfield Scott, as well as the U.S. military. And unfortunately, on the trail itself, they're going to have more than 4,000 Cherokee die. Again, coming back to this idea that there was resistance. And so kind of our second major idea and our learning target here is I can identify how some groups of Native Americans attempted to resist relocation. And in some cases, they were successful. Most of them, unfortunately, are going to have their lands taken by force. But I want to talk a little bit about some of those examples. So Sauk Chieftain Black Hawk organized a group to move back into Sauk lands in Illinois, and certainly going back to their ancestral homelands. But unfortunately, they almost in their entirety are slaughtered by the Illinois state militia as well as federal troops. And so again, not only denied that opportunity, but their lives are taken from them as well. You are going to see that a group in Florida, the Seminole people of Florida, are going to be led by a leader by the name of Osceola. And they're going to use guerrilla tactics in order to resist this relocation. Just a reminder, guerrilla tactics are referring to those surprise attacks or raids rather than using traditional, more organized warfare. And sometimes we call these hit and run tactics as well. The idea that you attack your enemy and then retreat and you chip away at sometimes a larger force. Only 110 government soldiers actually survived the Dade massacre. This is a very one-sided victory for the Seminole Nations. It's referred to as a massacre, but ultimately it is a successful defense by Native Americans. So we get to 1842, and again, this is largely done under Van Buren, but most Native Americans have since been moved west of the Mississippi. So when we get into the legacy of the Trail of Tears, we're seeing that this is going to set a precedent for ignoring a lot of these treaties. And unfortunately, this is one of the legacies of the federal government, state governments, and Native people, is a lot of these treaties get ignored. With, in some cases, there was no intention of ever keeping the promises. And so you're forcing hundreds of thousands of people west to relocate to an environment they've never lived in, and now they need to figure out how they're going to take care of themselves, how they're going to take care of their people and their families. They're also going to see that simply moving them is going to actually introduce new issues and new problems for other tribes that are living west, because now they're sharing land with all these new native people. And so you're going to see some rivalries get ignited out of this. You're going to see also a strain on resources, and we'll see, especially as we get further in U.S. history, examples of how this in some ways emboldens Native Americans to resist settlement west. So ladies and gentlemen, that's going to wrap up notes for today for section 2. For my students, make sure that you have been following along with the guided notes. Those of you who are in along just to listen and just to learn, I hope you learned something. I really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day, and that is going to conclude another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History.